Hey friends, it's Lee coming at you with another IG video, different from the one from the other day. I was looking back over some of the videos I posted at the height of the pandemic and around the January 6th, um, whatever we want to call that, January 6th insurrection or whatever, and how I was doing videos for a while that really sort of folded in my faith beliefs, eclectic as they may be, with my politics and sort of what I believe to be some sort of prophetic uh, things that I had to say. I'm going to go back to that. And so today, fair warning, this is going to be a long video, so feel free to tap out at any point that you get bored or get tired of my voice. I won't be offended, but I do think some folks will resonate with what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm actually going to be reading from a chapter of a book I'm writing called Aquifer. The book is called Aquifer, and this chapter is called Blood Moon. And for those of you who maybe who grew up in a fundamentalist church or fundamentalist sort of worldview, you may be nodding along and amening to this. And I hope that some people find it edifying. And maybe some of us will be challenged by it. I don't know. But if you don't like the idea of me reading to you story time with me, feel free to tap out. But if you do like it, maybe share, up to you. But hopefully this finds you in a place where you can hear it. Blood Moon. It was a summer night in Baltimore. My parents had sent my sister and I to stay for a couple of weeks with my grandparents. We'd moved to Ocean City, Maryland a couple of years before, but almost everyone else, our friends included, still lived in Baltimore. It was the summer of movies, Nintendo, playing on the parking pad out back, and walking down the block to the Zanino's corner store for a pack of candy cigarettes. It was a great time to be 10. Until the night of the blood moon. Okay, well, it wasn't a real blood moon, but still. It was well after midnight. A combination of thirst and uneasy sleep got me up. Looking back on it, I remember it being towards the end of our visit, and I was probably getting antsy to see my parents again. I waddled into the bathroom with a cup and filled it with water from the sink. To this day, I still can't decide if I should be drinking bathroom sink water, but oh well, I'd made it this far. After gulping it down, I stumbled back into the dark bedroom. It was the back bedroom, the one that faces the alley. Something caught my eye. A reddish light in the distance. I walked to the window and stared out. The moon was big and red. Reddish brown. I don't know. But to my 10-year-old mind, it was super red. I paused. Wasn't there something about a red moon in the Bible? I thought. My mind began to race. I was certain of it. A blood red moon. My brain was a mix of eschatological images driven in there by the Bible, Sunday school, talks with my mom, and insanely inappropriate movie choices made by adults in my church. I'm not the only one who was subjected to the Rapture and A Thief in the Night at too young of an age. Anyone alive during the heyday of Reagan-era moral majority, religious right Christianity was soaked in this kind of eschatology. The rapture, tribulation, the Antichrist, 666, all that good stuff. What a time to be alive. As a child, this view of things had the same effect on me as horror films. Like when I used to stay up late at my other grandmother's house and sneak in viewings of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Cujo, and various Friday the 13th movies. I contemplated whether the moon was indeed red enough to constitute the red moon from the apocalypse. It's a little brownish. Maybe that disqualified it. It was a close call. I stood there trying to read the signs against my limited understanding of bad theology. I was terrified. Could it be? Had I been left behind? Did Jesus come back on his cloud while I was asleep and take all the good Christians with him? Was I left to suffer through the coming tribulation, the mark of the beast, the beheadings? Was I going to have to live through all of it? To a child who believes in the rapture and in the tribulation, there is no more existentially horrible realization. I decided I needed to call my mom. She was one of the best people I knew and a very dedicated Christian. If Jesus would have raptured anyone, it would have been her. I reasoned that if she answered the phone, I was safe, that the rapture hadn't happened. I agonized until I finally fell asleep. The next morning I called her, and she answered. I was safe, for now. Now, I was too young to know that this scene should have prompted me to run as far away from fundamentalist Pentecostalism as I possibly could. But I was 10. I couldn't engage with those things yet. Even if I wanted to, what was I going to do? I was baptized a Catholic, whose mother left that church for a born-again church. Was I going to hitchhike to church to Mass every Sunday? No. And Catholics weren't really Christians anyway. I didn't really even know what denominations were yet. All I knew was there was Catholic, Christian, which we Pentecostals surely were, and then something that my grandparents vaguely referred to as the Greeks. It wasn't until years later that I would find out that there were various views on the eschaton, or the end of the world. Seems like some, like the more historical or preterist approach, seemed anathema to me way into my late teens. Don't get me wrong, it appealed to my heart and soul. I thought it made more sense to believe that the Apocalypse of John was really a cryptic, subversive text aimed squarely at a late first century audience in the apocalyptic genre. But I wasn't ready to abandon the dispensationalist or futurist view, mostly out of fear. For a fundamentalist, believing the exact right things could be the difference between heaven or hell. Fundamentalists believe that love is the root and branch of their faith, but it's actually fear. Abject fear. That young boy looking out on that moon didn't know what he believed. He loved God and believed God loved him, but that love was so intertwined with fear that I'd argue there really wasn't a difference between the two. When it comes to the divine, very little can actually be said with certainty. But one thing I feel deeply is that there is no eternal punishment or hell. Maybe there is, and I'll be there. I don't know, and I don't really care. If a God exists who would consign people to everlasting torment, then that God is demonic. I'd rather spend an eternity in anguished rebellion against such a tyrant than to acquiesce to its reign of terror. It took a long time for me to come to that realization. My struggle with the idea of hell was intense and ongoing until I neared 30. It finally began to shatter on a day in Alaska. I was in Alaska on a ministry trip with an evangelical group called Master's Commission. I was in Masters, which is what we called it for short, for 3 years. And I was, some of you are not going to believe this, but I was a hair's breadth away from getting ordained in the Assemblies of God. I'm glad I didn't. That inevitable divorce would have been quick and ugly. Well, we were doing drama-based ministry in the Palmer Correctional Center and in a drug rehab house. We had an afternoon off from the work, so we were just all sort of hanging around the cabin where we stayed. It was beautiful moose and bear country that I'd love to revisit someday. I wandered through the cabin and found a quiet room where no one was. My eyes widened. It was a library. There were a couple large beaten bookshelves packed with what I was obsessed with, books. I skimmed the spines and was mostly disappointed. It was a lot of drug and alcohol rehab stuff and what I considered to be boring fluff, like Prayer of Jabez and stupid Joyce Meyer. Even though I was still entrenched in evangelicalism, my slide towards the edge of it had already begun. I mean no disrespect, but I was not looking to read Max Lucado, Jim Cymbala, or the latest interpretation of the end times. My bread and butter in my late teens and early 20s was C.S. Lewis, Thomas Merton, and by then I was really getting into Rob Bell, Shane Claiborne, and Jim Wallace. Actually, Rob Bell's provocative book, Velvet Elvis, was later put on the list of banned books at my master's commission branch. Thankfully, I had already moved on from the group. Otherwise, I'd have raised hell about that. My finger stopped on a book that piqued my interest. It was C.S. Lewis. So far, so good. It was called The Great Divorce. I recognized the title, but somehow this one had escaped my reading. At the time, I was super into Narnia, Mere Christianity, and especially A Grief Observed. The Great Divorce was a short little thing, and I had time. Everyone else was napping, playing games, or sitting by the campfire. I pulled up a chair right at the foot of the bookshelf, and I finished the book in one sitting. Lewis's story of the afterlife is funny, witty, and poignant in all the expected C.S. Lewis ways. The book recounts the story of a bus trip from hell to heaven. And in this version of the afterlife, those consigned to a gray, dull hell, they get a pass to check out heaven. If they want to stay, they can. If not, well, they can get right back on the bus to hell. It's really that simple. The twist of the story, and the thing that finally shattered the concept of a traditional hell for me, is this. Some of these people, these characters, choose their own suffering instead of paradise for complex socio-emotional reasons, not because God condemned them to flames for eternity. Lewis writes in the book, quote, "There are only two kinds of people in the end, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, in the end, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find, those who knock, it is opened." End of quote. Those in C.S. Lewis's hell consistently and steadfastly choose it at each moment. Note the key word there, choose, not chose. Present tense, not past tense. In the world of the Great Divorce, the veil between heaven and hell is as thin as one's state of mind. Since this chapter isn't going to be a summary of his book, I won't go into a lot of detail about how this works, but if you are wondering why anyone would choose to stay in hell given the option of making heaven home, I suggest you find the book. It is convincing and compelling, and also truly it's an incredibly effective exploration of the human psyche. This simple seed of this idea planted itself in my brain that day. From there it grew and then finally overran the garden of my mind. Its roots slowly broke apart the foundations laid there in my childhood. It began to grow into something new, scary, and unpredictable. I no longer believed in an eternal place called hell. I just didn't know it yet. In my view, the very idea of an eternal hell is abhorrent. Eternal conscious punishment for a penalty, as the penalty, for not believing the right things during the tiny sliver of time we are allotted in a human lifespan is not justice, it's sadistic. Any divine being who would ignore the complex psychological, historical, social, and philosophical tapestry which causes people to be who they are, believe what they believe, and trust what they trust, in delivering a sentence as horrific as eternal damnation is not a god, it is a demon. Now, I know that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of fancy apologetics, or what I sometimes call apologymnastics, that attempt to answer this problem. These justifications usually emphasize that God is love, but God is almost always a he in these discussions, but he is also just. What will follow is the litany of proof-texted Bible verses that seem to support the argument that a loving God must also be just and therefore something hell. I was gaslighted into believing this at some point. I didn't want to believe that people went to hell, but I did anyway because it was true. In addition, a fundamentalist faith is built like a house of cards. If you stop believing in one card, the entire thing collapses. I will never forget when in my early 20s I began to actively poke holes in the Genesis creation account, as it's written in the Bible. I had friends who were dismayed, and they explained to me that if I didn't believe in the literal 6-day creation sequence from the Genesis account, then my entire scriptural foundation was rotten. They were able to draw a straight line from a 6-day creation all the way to Jesus and salvation. If I didn't believe in one of them, then there's no basis to believe in the other. This is all rooted in the fundamentalist insistence on the inerrancy of Holy Scripture. Though there is a range of interpretation within the inerrancy camp, most of the ones I've known, including a younger version of myself, believe that the Bible is basically without error, period. Inconsistencies on the numbers, there's an explanation for that. A miraculous story doesn't line up with what we clearly know about cosmology and the laws of nature. Well, either science is wrong or it just hasn't caught up yet. Modern neuroscience and sociology disagree with a claim that's made in a verse of the Bible, dismissed out of hand. Fundamentalism is the poster child for confirmation biases. I'm breaking out of the book here for a second. Pay attention to this part, because it is easy to mock people who believe this. Okay? But let's resist that urge. Back into the chapter. On one hand, this is perfectly understandable. There is a reason people flock to religious practices that promise certainty and assurance. We hover over an abyss of existential uncertainty. In Moby Dick, Melville asked the question as well as anyone, quote, "Where lies the final harbor, whence we unmoor no more? In what rapt ether sails the world, of which the weariest will never weary? Where is the founding's father hidden? Our souls are like those orphans whose unwedded mothers die in bearing them. The secret of our paternity lies in their grave, and we must there to learn it." End of quote. We seek safe harbor. It's that simple. Being a human being in this universe is hard as hell. It is natural to seek solace and assurances that won't fail us. It's also more than mere spirituality. To the extent that there even is a meaningful distinction, it's also the legacy of our evolution. The old part of our brain, the reptilian brain, is the fight, flight, or freeze trigger. This ancient part of the brain is responsible for our physical survival as a species, but it's also the source of so much turmoil. As a species, in order to survive, we've had to calculate risk, uncertainty, and danger. We have had to hedge against those things. Too many unknowns, and our reptilian brain stays in constant vigilance because its job is to keep us alive. The problem with constant vigilance is that it wears us down, literally. Our adrenal glands produce cortisol, which is a stress hormone that gives us the energy to function during a flight or fight kind of situation. Our ancestors needed this to survive saber-toothed tiger attacks, and we need it at various times as well. The key here is that cortisol is not supposed to be coming from an open faucet in our brains. It's supposed to turn on when we need it, when we really need it, and then turn off when we don't. When the faucet is left on by real or imagined threats, real damage is done. One of the many tragedies of poverty is the way that it forces human beings to keep the cortisol drip on. The result of that is heart disease, depression, digestion issues, a lack of mental focus. Ideally, in a modern society, a person would rarely have to be in full fight or flight situations, so they should have a balanced adrenal gland situation. Again, I say ideally. This applies to our spiritual problems, specifically fundamentalisms. Look, being a human is already an existentially fraught thing to begin with, and that's before you even fold in any notion of God. or eternity. It is my contention that fundamentalism is the mind's attempt to regulate our physical and spiritual cortisol. We are unmoored in this universe, and our natural instinct is to reach out for something concrete, certain, and absolute. It gives us a feeling of safety, rest, and helps to ease the state of existential vertigo. In short, fundamentalism is an immune response. As such, we should view it, dangerous as it is, with the same compassion that we might hold for a bear which lay dying in a trap. It will kill us if we free it. It must die, suffering as it is, but it is also a sacred thing. There is wisdom in the wound. And let's be clear, fundamentalism takes many forms, secular and religious. I've seen it on the right and on the left, among Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Jews. It exists among atheists, progressives, and anarchists. In short, no one is exempt from the constant need for certainty. Later in this book, which is outside of this video, we will explore why, despite my warnings, we must still say a few things for certain. See, I've already contradicted myself. The reason why my fundamentalist friends were so indignant about my questioning the creation account in Genesis or the concept of an eternal hell is because these questions raise their cortisol levels, their spiritual cortisol levels. The entire project of fundamentalist apologetics is to construct airtight defenses against attack on any single aspect of their theological house of cards. They are experts at explaining in detail how if you take this one card out, then the rest of the house necessarily falls with it. It's an effective fear-based strategy. The implied warning is, if you don't believe this one thing, you've poked a hole in the dam, and you'd better be ready because there's a flood of heresy coming your way, and it'll lead you to hell. Actually, it's not really implied. I was actually told that once. Again, it's effective until it's not. In a very real sense, to question whether or not God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour periods of time is to have the floor open up into a black hole. I felt that at one point in my journey, and it is a genuinely scary feeling. That boy standing in the back bedroom, fretting over the apocalypse and the rapture and the beheadings and the love of God, I have compassion on him and on every grown-up who taught him that nonsense. As my therapist says, there's light and wisdom in every dark cloud, just as there's a little darkness in every light cloud. He's a Taoist, and he's also super into Joseph Campbell. Wisdom, true wisdom, comes from looking for the nuance. That child's view of God was unintelligible. Sure, absolutely. But that view was ultimately born from a human desire to stand on solid ground, to have something to be certain. You see, there's some beauty there, even in the shit. And here's the part that might rub some of you the wrong way. Though I might be able to separate the gold from the dross in my fundamentalist upbringing, I am going to definitively say that fundamentalism is dross and it must be tossed out. Fundamentalism, immune response to existential terror as it may be, is a weapon of mass destruction. If you're asking my opinion, it's one of the world's greatest threats. Fundamentalism flies planes into buildings. It denies women rights. It stymies climate action and environmental protections. It strips minority and oppressed peoples of their inherent dignity. It creates psychological trauma. Fundamentalism has driven failed political revolutions on the left and has made capitalism a golden calf on the right. Fundamentalism drives resentment and cruelty on every socio-political front on social media. It is a plague on all our houses. Now, that's not lazy both sidesism. It's just objectively true. I can almost hear some of my fellow lefties getting your feathers ruffled at hearing that. But fundamentalisms make gods out of rules and texts. Operating as a human in the world is to be in constant negotiation with other people and places and feelings and ideas. It is a messy business, influencing and being influenced by others. It used to be easier for cultures to be insulated, preferring their own beliefs and excluding others. And there is some wisdom there, and there's something Pope Francis calls cultural imperialism, and that's a real danger. Global capitalism does in fact tend to decimate cultural specificity and beauty, flattening every nation it encounters into a kind of bland Western-style consumer culture, and often in the name of liberal democratic values. Surely there is some way to promote human rights and human flourishing in a way that protects a culture's uniqueness and splendor, but that's probably an entire book unto itself. Still, the reality is that the internet and widespread travel have made it harder for hardliners to prevent interaction with new ideas and viewpoints. This exposure means less certainty in your own beliefs. Unfortunately, most people's interior structure is not as strong and flexible enough to absorb the truth in another belief and even to incorporate it. The result? We tighten the screws, we reinforce the walls, we patrol the premises of belief more and more strictly. Look no further than the rise of Islam since the 1970s. The rise of fundamentalism in Islam since the 1970s. And in the West, the rise of ethno-nationalistic Christianity, the new atheism of the mid-2000s, and in the illiberal leftism and putrid rightism of Twitter. A note on that last part. I flatly reject the false equivalencies of the new right and the new left today. There is no comparison, except in as much as I believe the tendency towards rigid fundamentalism is present in both. The project of the left, with which I identify, is laudable in my opinion, even if I take issues with its strategies from time to time. However, the Trumpism of the right is inherently anti-democratic, retrograde, and proudly racist. In other words, fundamentalism answers the door, sees a stranger, and installs more locks on the door. The locks take the form of rules, beliefs, and practices which are like a bouncer at the door of a club. This may be a productive way of constructing a culture at the early stages of its development, protecting a brand new religion or ideology in its fragile infancy, or reconstructing your identity. This is what Richard Rohr calls first stage of life thinking. In his book, Falling Upward, he makes the case that starting out life with guardrails and then growing out of them is easier and more psychologically profitable than starting with an open field of possibilities with no limits and then later having to learn boundaries and structure. As a high school teacher, my experience validates his thesis. Nonetheless, the point is to move beyond the childishness of walls and locks to the maturity of bridges and open arms. I want to reiterate that it is important to develop a healthy and sane worldview. If in deconstructing fundamentalisms and belief, I accidentally give you permission to indulge chaotic, amorphous, egocentric ways of thinking, then I failed. The old saying goes that you have to learn the rules to be able to break them well, and it's a wise saying. We're going to talk more about how to thread that needle later on. And that's the end of the chapter. Sorry for the lateness, but I want to show you this picture here of me. I'm in the red and blue jumpsuit there, taking communion at the Pentecostal church that I attended here in Baltimore when I was a kid. And this is the very room where we were also shown Thief in the Night and the Rapture. That story I told at the very beginning of me in my grandparents' bedroom in the blood moon, I believe is still one of the fundamental self-archetypal images in my life. Anyway, sorry, I had a couple of breaks in there. Hopefully some of the edits won't be too harsh, but my dog started barking. My Uber Eats was delivered. A whole bunch of stuff happened, so I got frustrated and bounced out. But feel free to leave a comment, share, or throw in the trash if you want. But if I get any response to this, then maybe I'll do some more talks, maybe even some more chapters. We'll see what happens. Anyway, have a blessed one. Peace.